Well everyone, thank you for joining me for yet another video. Today I'm going to change the servo in the Arrma Granite here. Well guys, thank you for joining me for yet another video. As I mentioned in the intro, today we're going to change the servo in the Arrma Granite here. Now this also works for the Arrma Senton in the brushed and the 3S version, as well as the Arrma Typhon in the brushed and 3S version. The tools we're going to need are just simply Allen wrenches. Today I'm going to be using these Allen drivers as well as my electric screwdriver here. Now, I've used this in many of my videos. This is a pretty neat tool. When we push down the trigger, nothing will actually happen. But as we rotate the tool, the gyroscopic technology in here will cause the tool to rotate in the direction of my preference. Now the first step, what we're going to do is of course remove the body, and we're going to rotate the vehicle over so we can get a look at the bottom. Now with Arrma's design here, it's pretty simple. You can pull the whole radio package out of your vehicle by removing these 4 screws. So 1, 2, 3, and 4. There's also a little screw hidden down inside of here where it connects to your servo arm. So I'm going to go ahead and remove those screws now. Alright, so now that all of those screws are removed, we can pull out our radio box here. Now there are some cables that are stored in this little clasp assembly that's right here. So opening this up will give you a little bit extra room to work with so that your cables aren't holding this radio box in place. Now once this radio box is uninstalled here, you get a really good look underneath the radio box. And if you'll notice, they actually give you instructions underneath here on how to center up your servo once you've replaced it. So that's kind of a really neat feature, a really thoughtful feature that Arrma has included in these models. Our next step is going to be removing the screws that hold the servo down in our vehicle. Now if you have the brushless version, this on-off switch is going to be in the way of that screw. So we need to start by removing that. Now, like I mentioned in most of my videos, try and store your screws in the places that they belong, so that way you remember where they go. Now, I did not do that on my mount screws, but I'll go ahead and do that now just for continuity's sake. Storing your screws in these holes is always a good idea. That way, if you do have quite a lot of hardware from your disassembly, this will make things a lot easier for you to remember where they go. You'll see that screw is kind of already staying there, so I'm just going to leave that in place for the time being. Now that your on-off switch is out of the way, now we can have access to your mount screws to hold your servo in. Sometimes these screws do get stuck on your driver. I'm sure you've noticed that happen a couple of times. So if you do run into that, give it a little bit of wiggle and it will come loose. Now your servo is free of your radio box, but you'll notice that this servo saver is holding it in place, so we need to remove that as well. Now a tip for you, whenever you're removing these screws, hold these servo arms in place when you remove that screw. This way you're putting all the pressure on the servo saver and not on the servo, and that will limit the possibility that you can strip out your servo gears. Once that screw is removed, you should just be able to pop off this servo saver. And when these servo savers are being stubborn, like this one is, a little bit of pressure with your Allen driver will just pop that right off of there. Now your servo is free of your vehicle, and we need to get in the receiver box, which is located under this speed controller here. And you'll get there by removing the 2 screws, one on this side and one on this side in order to remove your speed controller and your receiver cover. Now that that cover is out of the way, you get a good look at the mess that's inside of your receiver box. This is pretty normal when we see opening up receiver boxes. There's a lot of extra cable that's included with any of your equipment. So it's a nice place to hide it and keep it safekeeping. There's a waterproof like jacket right here that is a seal rather that is holding all of your cables. And your servo, of course, is the one on the bottom one. So we just need to lift all of these cables out of here. This doesn't take very much pressure to lift these cables out and unplug the servo from your receiver. Now just down inside of here there is a little keeper that will hold your servo wires in place, and you do need to pop your servo wires out of that little keeper that's there. I don't know if you can see it, it's kind of a little like a channel for it to sit in. Once that's done, our servo is now uninstalled from the vehicle. Now before I reinstall my servo, I wanted to point out to you a little trick that I mentioned earlier in storing your screws in the places that they belong. That way when you get near the end of your project, you know exactly where your screws go. Now if you'll notice, I have not done that throughout most of my video, and what I've ended up with here is a handful of screws, and if you're not familiar with vehicles, you may not understand where these belong. Now fortunately, I have been paying attention, and I know that this countersunk screw belongs in the servo saver, and these screws with the washers hold the servo down to the vehicle. The screws without hold the speed controller and the receiver box closed. So this is why it's important that if you're unfamiliar that you go ahead and store these screws in a place that they belong in. It just makes it easier on you in the long run. Now let's go ahead and reinstall our servo. So this cable right here is going to pass through that little channel that's located here. Now that cable should be going down. So if you have your servo outside of the box, that cable should be running down into the receiver box. Now this little keeper is pretty stiff, so it does take some pressure to get that all installed in there, like so. And the servo will bolt down. Now if you'll notice, this servo has two directions, so you could install it potentially this way with the cable running to the left. You could install it this way with the cable running to the right. And if you get confused, refer back to your manual down here on the bottom, and this will tell you that that servo saver needs to install this way. Now if you installed that servo backward, then you wouldn't be allowed to match that picture. So that's, again, a very nice, thoughtful feature that Arrma has included in these models. Before I bolt that servo down, I do want to run all these cables back through our waterproof box here. I'm going to install the servo last, just because that's a personal preference, but it doesn't necessarily have to work that way. But we've installed that receiver antenna down here. We are installing this cable next, this one, and finally the servo wire. Now on Spectrum receivers, if you'll notice the receiver down here on the bottom, I don't know if it comes off really well on camera, but they are marked auxiliary, THR, and STR. STR is your steering, and we're going to install that cable here. Now this last cable, this gray one here, sometimes that cable is white, sometimes that cable is, I've seen it be orange from time to time, but always remember to line these up in their proper orientation. So the center pin is always going to be positive, equivalent to red. The outer pin here is going to be black or brown, and just line it up with your servo wires there. Now that these cables are installed, I'm going to pull these back a little bit to kind of shorten them, get as much of that cabling in that box as I can. Now that all of our cables are installed, I would recommend go ahead and installing the receiver box cover and your speed controller. That way all these wires will kind of keep in place, and it helps to keep this from flopping around and kind of getting in your way. So you just find it a little easier to deal with everything that's here if you go ahead and close up this box. Be careful when you close up this box not to pinch any of the cables in the inside, because that will cause more problems in the future. When you're tightening screws with this power tool, you do want to be very careful not to strip out hardware. So I always like to do a final tightening by hand and not using the mechanism within the tool. Paying attention to what direction that cable is pointing when we reinstall that servo. That way we don't install things incorrectly. And being careful, see what I'm doing right there? See how that cable right there is kind of caught underneath that servo? So we want to be very careful because we don't want to pinch those cables. All right, now that those screws are in, we're going to give these a final tighten, not using the power driver, just using hand torque. And your servo is reinstalled. Then the next thing we're going to do is go ahead and put our on-off switch back on the vehicle. And a final tighten. Okay, so now comes the point where we have to reinstall our servo saver here. This does require you to turn on your vehicle because you want to make sure, sorry, I had that upside down. You want to make sure that you're following these instructions here by centering up your throttle trim. So we're going to go ahead and power this on. Now once this is powered on, we're going to come to our controller, and you want to look for your ST trim. And if you look closely, cover up that light, maybe you see it better, that's not quite centered, it's not quite zero. So line up the triangle with the marker on your controller to assure that you are in the centered position. Now you'll follow the instructions that is printed on the bottom here. So see the arrow that's located on your servo saver. Maybe I can make that focus. There's an arrow that's located right here. That arrow needs to line up with this marker. There's also an arrow up here. So make sure that that's all lined up when you install the servo. Now you will notice that it won't be perfectly lined up. So you'll see that the arrows aren't just quite perfect, but that's okay. That's where our trim comes from on our controller. So if we trim those lines so that they line up, that's going to be properly lined up on this end of it. It just makes it so much easier to reinstall your servo in your vehicle. We're going to put our screw back in here. And remember, like I mentioned before, when you're tightening or loosening these screws, make sure that you are holding this servo arm. Put all the stress on the servo arm, not on the servo gears when you're tightening up those screws. Now that that's finished, we can go ahead and power off all of our electronics because we don't need those on anymore. Okay, so before we continue forward, I wanted to point one more thing out here. If you look down inside of this servo arm right here, there is a nut down on the inside. Now when you go to put this screw back in that nut, it might push that nut out and hit the floor or bounce somewhere. So make sure you're paying attention when you go to reinstall this, that nut doesn't come out, because as soon as it does, you're going to have a hard time getting things tightened and back in place. Now as we push forward, if you remember, all these cables were kind of pushed underneath this little keeper that's right here. Now if you push everything back down in there again, it does hold things in place for you while you're trying to get everything lined back up. So I'm going to get those pushed back down. So I have all of those pushed back down in that keeper, everything except for the power cable, because you're not going to be able to have enough length if you do that. I'm going to go ahead and plug that here. Now we're going to remove these 4 screws that we put in here for safekeeping so that we don't lose where they belong. And we're going to put our radio box back inside here. As a personal preference, I do like to try and line up this hole, this screw with this hole, before I bolt down these screws here, because it can be a little tricky to get them all lined up just perfect. So because I have this camera like right in front of my face here, I may go off camera to try and line up that hole. You see the hole down inside there, trying to line up that screw with that hole. So I may be back, or I may just get it first time. We'll see what happens here. All right, welcome back. So as you saw, I did have to go off camera rather, like I thought I would, but I do have that screw properly installed. So we're going to continue by reinstalling our remaining 4 screws here, and that should complete our repair. Now, just as a verification that this is actually finished, we're going to go ahead and power on all of our equipment here, and we will see that our steering is working. Well, as you can see, this completes the repair of a servo in our Arrma Granite here. And remember, this also works in the Senton and the Typhon models as well. I'm going to put the total completion time right about here. If you benefited from this video in any way, please consider giving me a thumbs up, a subscription, and if you want to see notifications when new videos goes up, don't forget to hit that bell. I mention this in all of my videos. If you're not hitting that bell, you're not getting notifications when new videos go up. So make sure that you go do that for all of your subscriptions. Well, that's going to wrap up this video, and I hope to see you in the next one.